You might have some idea as to what a worldview is simply by the two terms that make up the compound word. In particular, we're interested in the religious worldview as opposed to, say, a secular one or maybe a scientific materialist one. But for now, let's address the general term and make it as clear as we can by first getting to the origins of the word and then, as in the previous discussion, come up with a working definition for the purposes at hand. Worldview derives originally from the German Weltanschauung. Welt meaning world, and if I reach for my Langenscheidt dictionary here, Anschauung meaning view, opinion, or idea. Worldview, then, is fair enough as a simple translation. As for a definition or definitions, you can find them for yourself online, most of which say something to the effect of a perspective on life, or view of the meaning of life, or as Merriam-Webster has it, the way someone thinks about the world. Now, that latter description certainly captures the philosophy of it. The term, in fact, originally developed among 19th century German philosophers. Scholars often point out that it was coined by Immanuel Kant, whom I referred to in the previous video. At the risk of oversimplification, consider this. Have you ever heard someone say, "I just think we all have a purpose in life," or "I think we're all here for a reason"? Often such comments lead to opinions about what that purpose might be, or who or what lies behind the fabric of the universe that gives us that purpose, and maybe more importantly, how we ought to relate to everything around us in light of it. That, in a very basic sense, is what we're getting at here. Now, there are a lot of in-depth studies out there, and as one would expect, a variety of opinions as to what makes a good, more well-rounded explanation of the concept beyond a simple dictionary definition. As we exercise in our parish profiles, one ought to consider a variety of interdisciplinary ideas to arrive at a fuller explanation of a concept. One such angle I'd like for us to focus on here, one that's particularly useful for the course, comes from the perspective of anthropology. It not only presents us with a broader understanding of the term, but it also takes into account the religious aspect inherent in it. Let's take a look at it in illustrative form. This is a classic theory that originated with a professor out of the University of Chicago in the mid-20th century, the late Robert Redfield. Redfield held that societies, particularly those influenced little by today's secularism, generally or universally believe that there are three things in the universe that relate to one another and to which humankind bears some obligation. Redfield illustrated this with a basic triangle. On the one side we have the divine, which includes notions about God or the gods, demonic entities, angels, or other forms of life thought to share our world and interact with us from time to time. On the other, we have humankind, and on the other, nature. From a human standpoint, whatever obligations humanity has toward the other two entities, the divine and the natural world, ultimately the responsibility is to uphold those relationships and to keep them in harmony. Although it is certainly dated, and there are a lot of limitations to Redfield's universal model, scholars have well pointed them out, his basic view works, as this ostensibly simple relationship triangle, as we'll call it for our purposes, can be seen in the beliefs and practices of the major world religions today in differing degrees, the exception, of course, being, again, Theravada Buddhism as mentioned earlier. As an example, think of what you know from the Bible and what scholars call the biblical worldview. In Genesis chapter 1, we find a personal, sovereign God who created the world in perfect goodness and harmony and gave order to it. He created human beings in his image, or likeness, and then gave them charge over the natural world. Here we can see the relationship triangle at work. God creates the natural order. He creates humans distinct from himself, but in his image. Humans are, because of that single quality, a part of the natural world, but yet separate from it. Now, as for the rest of the story, if you took Bible and Western culture, you recall that humans were given charge over the natural world, but then something tragic happened. Our first parents disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden and broke that sacred relationship. The natural order started to decay as a result of evil, sin, and death being ushered into the world in a dynamic way. And from chapter 12 of Genesis on through the book of Revelation of the New Testament, the biblical story is about what God the Creator is doing to restore that relationship triangle, particularly through the calling of the people of Israel, and ultimately through the redemptive role of Jesus the Messiah, aka Christ, in his death, burial, and resurrection on behalf of humankind, and from a Pauline perspective, for the restoration of the entire created order. Finally, with such a perspective on the world, which is a religious one, and this needs to be emphasized here, relationships are sacred and we as humans need to keep those relationships in harmony the best we can, amongst ourselves as humans, between us and the natural world around us, between us and the supernatural world that interacts with us. That is the worldview we are going to utilize in this class. How is this course one that is going to place so much emphasis on examining technology, a religious one? And you'll be asking yourself that question several times. It is religious in that we are borrowing one aspect of religion, an aspect that we find across the religious spectrum, the very basic worldview they share, to assess the overall value of the technology people are creating and using in the world today. We're not going to delve into religious texts such as the Bible or the Quran or perhaps even the Bhagavad Gita looking for nuanced religious ideologies to gain perspectives on technology, nor are we going to bring into discussion religious ethics per se. That would take too long for what amounts to a trimester course. Moreover, and more importantly, it simply isn't necessary. We can utilize the basic religious worldview to accomplish our goal. Lastly, why does a basic understanding of worldview matter? To exemplify the power of it, the power that is over how we think and behave in the world, compare the religious point of view to another one prevalent in our culture. Within our Western world today, we often see these two worldviews in conflict. The religious one, which we've just examined, and the scientific one, or better, scientistic materialist worldview based exclusively on empirical observation of the natural world and inductive and also deductive reasoning about those observations. If we were to bring up our triangle again, what changes would we make to it if we held a scientistic worldview? Well, we'd have to remove the supernatural, so let's X that out. We'd also have to remove the distinction between humanity and nature, at least in the typical religious sense of the idea, as humans are simply part of nature, and thus we really don't have a triangle anymore, we're just left with nature. Now, imagine for a moment how such a view might affect a person's thoughts and behavior, especially how they think about themselves and other human beings, the broader world around them, and the innovation and application of modern technology. Compare that yet again with our first model, and you get the idea as to just how fundamentally important worldviews are, and why they matter in this course. As a final note, one thing I need to draw your attention to is that this is where we will diverge from the approach of our textbook author, Hersfeld. Whereas she does approach technology from the purview of its effects on human relationships, she focuses on the notion of the human exercise of dominion over the earth, a concept within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam based on the creation narrative found in Genesis, which I alluded to earlier. As discussed, we are sticking with her emphasis on the relationships issue, but simplifying our approach to focus only on the worldview model we've been talking about. We'll go over this and demonstrate it as we continue with the course. We'll discuss it too at our next face-to-face meeting. To continue on with our discussion, select the next video entitled Session 2, Part 3.